We are now on Daf Sadihei Amid Beis, in the middle of the Daf. And we got up to Ka'omar Tanakam. We're going back to our Mishnah, and we're talking about a case of Rachel who returned from Medina Sayyam. And the Mishnah was of the opinion that she's allowed to resume her marriage relationship with we called him Avram. And that's even though Avram, based on the assumption, the testimony of an aide, married Leah because he was of the opinion, the impression that Rachel had died. Lo shna al pi eidir. If, let's say, there were two witnesses that testified that Rachel had died, and then Avram went ahead and he married Leah, the same two Eidim or another pair of Eidim testified that Yitzchak was married to Leah, had died. Eshes Giso Sharia. This is the Shita Rabbi Shimon, that Eshes Giso, which means Leah, the wife of Yitzchak, can resume her marriage with Yitzchak. Leah and Yitzchak can resume their marriage. So I have here a diagram, and we have the two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Avram married Rachel, Yitzchak married Leah. Rachel and Yitzchak both went out to Medina Sayyam. Aiden testified that Yitzchak and Rachel had died, and Avram married Leah. Afterwards, Rachel and Yitzchak come back from Medina Sayyam. They're both alive and well. So now we understand that Leah, by being married to Avram, was what we call a tumah of Eshes Ish. And on top, to boot, she was also Achos Ishto. Rachel is allowed to resume her marriage with Avram, even though Avram was married to her sister Leah. And this again reflects the opinion of our Mishnah back on Sadi Dalet, that a relationship with your wife's sister does not generate an Isser between you and your wife. Leah, who was married to Avram's brother-in-law, Yitzchak, is allowed to resume her marriage with Yitzchak because she was Nises al pi Shnei Eidim. As if to say, we cannot penalize neither Yitzchak nor Leah second, right? For the relationship that Leah had with Avram, because she was relying on the testimony of two witnesses. And this can actually substantiate or confirm the logic of Rabbi Yossi that we discussed at great length yesterday, that since Avram that we should be consistent, meaning that if Avram in his relationship with Leah does not generate an Isser on Yitzchak, then he does not generate an Isser on his own wife, Rachel. And we went back and forth exactly whether we start with Rachel and then with Leah, or start with Leah and then with Rachel. Lo shna al pi bezdin. Now, al pi bezdin always means that there was only one aid. As we said yesterday, if there are two witnesses, you don't even need bezdin. She can get married based on the testimony of two witnesses. But if there's only one witness, then we need bezdin to upgrade the status of one aid and make him into two aid. So now what happens in the case where there was only one witness? In the case where there were two witnesses, we said everybody's mutter, meaning Avram can resume his relationship, his marriage with Rachel, and Yitzchak can resume his relationship with Leah. But in the case where there were no two Eidim, but rather one Eid, and that's called Al Pi Bezdin, Eshes Giso Asira Labaila. Yitzchak is not allowed, he's not permitted to resume his relationship with Leah. Just 1 second. The Eshes Giso Asira. So again, according to the Tanakama, in all cases, Rachel can resume her marriage relationship with Avram. Meaning, even in a case where there was one aid, and the law would be that Eshes Giso Asira al Baila, nevertheless, as far as Achosu is concerned, Muteres Labaila. What does that mean? He says the following: Kevan she'ein lomer she'achosa nisgarsha mibaila rishon. We're not going to assume that Leah received a get from Yitzchak, her husband, and then she got married to Avram, which would mean that she's grushoso liachar shenises, but rather eina tzricha get mibal achos. Leah does not need a get from Avram. And therefore, there's not going to be an Isur between Rachel and Avram. Because Rachel is not Eshes Grushasa. I'm sorry, it's not Achos Grushasa. So Eshes Giso Asira, because we're going to impose, I guess, a kind of a penalty here. Oh, he says in the footnote, Mishum Knas, it's a penalty. Konsu Chachamim, because she shouldn't have relied on 1/8. And Beis Din assumed that if she's willing to get remarried, she must have checked out the situation that she was absolutely certain that Yitzchak, her husband, was dead. But that didn't happen. She really didn't examine the situation, and therefore she's at fault for marrying Avram. Therefore, in the relationship between Leah and Yitzchak, we're going to apply the principle of Tumah, that she's an Ashes Ish that had a relationship out of marriage, an adulterous relationship, and she cannot resume her relationship with Yitzchak. But we're not going to require a get from Avram to Leah. If we would, then Avram would not be able to be Aser on Ishto Rachel, because Rachel, would now become Ashes Achos Gruchos. So this is the Tanakam. Rabbi Yossi. Now again, all this is Rabbi Ami trying to offer a new interpretation of Rabbi Yossi. He says the following: Al pi Beis Din, meaning if there was only one witness, and she went ahead and got married based on one witness, the posel al yidei acherim, posel al yidei atzma. Acherim here, I believe, let me double check, refers to Yitzchak. Oh, 1 second. Just 1 second. Posel al yidei acherim shenimtza shenisuav liachoso lachos hoil leposal bayit. Oh, yeah, I think I'm right. In other words, when Leah got married to Avram, that marriage is going to generate an Iser between Leah and Yitzchak. In the case of Eid Echad, of Nisei Salpi Beis Din. Is therefore, says Rabbi Yossi, let's be consistent. If you're telling me that the marriage relationship between Avram and Leah is going to be recognized as a marriage relationship such that it generates an Iser between Leah and Yitzchak, then it should likewise create an Iser between Rachel and Avram, because now Rachel becomes Achos Ishto. Now again, are we requiring a get? That's what I'd love to know. Oh, he says in the note, Kevan she'eshes kitzo stricha mimenu get esrol of ishto minishuna achos kushos. So again, even though the marriage between Avram and Leah is only a rabbinic marriage, it's not a real marriage according to Torah law, but nevertheless the Rabbanan set it up and recognized it as a marriage to require a get. And if that be the case, then as far as Yitzchak is concerned, we have a case of grushaso liacher sheniseis liacher. In other words, the Rabbanan are going to consider it as if, in the eyes of the spectator, Yitzchak had delivered a get to his wife Leah. We don't, the people don't know the truth that Yitzchak never gave a get to his wife Leah, but they see that Leah is getting remarried, so they assume Yitzchak must have given a get. When in truth, the reason why Leah got remarried is because she relied on one aid that Yitzchak had died. But once we are choshesh for the spectators who view the marriage of Leah as being valid, as if her husband Yitzchak had delivered a get to her, then now, if she's getting a get from Avram, because we're recognizing that marriage b'drabanan, then Yitzchak is now in a situation of HS of Grushas Aliachas and Nises, and says Rabbi Yossi, Posel al Yidei Atzmo. Now, if we're recognizing the marriage between Avram and Leah on a Drabanan level, therefore, Rachel becomes Achos Ishta, Achos Grushasa. Alpi Shnei Edim, Alpi Edim, Di'eno Posel al Yidei Acherim. Like we said before, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi also concurs with that opinion, that the Bia does not generate an Israel bylaw, meaning that Yitzchak is not prohibited from resuming his relationship with Leah because Leah relied on the testimony of two Eidim, and therefore there was no element of guilt or anything like that. Is therefore Eino Posel Yidei Atzmo. There's no recognition of the relationship, the marriage relationship between Avram and Leah, and therefore he can resume his marriage. That means that Avram can resume his marriage with Rachel. Once again, he has a diagram. Rachel and Leah, two sisters. Avram marries Rachel, Yitzchak marries Leah. Rachel and Yitzchak go out to Medina Sayam. And in this case, one witness testifies that Yitzchak and Rachel both died. Avram marries Leah. Then Rachel and Yitzchak are alive and well. They come back from Medina Sayam. So in this case, according to Rabbi Ami's understanding of Rabbi Yossi, Leah cannot resume our relationship with Yitzchak because she was Nises Alpi Bezdin. There was no clear-cut indication that she could get married, that her husband had in fact died. There was only one aide. The Bezdin allowed her to get married because they relied on her, that she certainly clarified, investigated, and knows that Yitzchak is dead. Aval Gabe Rachel, Im Muteres Lachzol Avram, Nechluku Tanakama Rabbi Yosef, the Das Tanakama Muteres. Kidin, Nosas Achos Ishto, She'en Ishto Neseres. But as we said at great length back in the Mishnah, that if a man marries the sister of his wife, Leah, he marries Leah, the sister of his wife, Rachel, he doesn't become Asur on Rachel. Right? There was no Ma'aseh Tumah B'Gufa, if you remember that. However, Rabbi Yossi holds that once you're passing al Yidei Acherim, meaning you're breaking up the marriage between Leah and Yitzchak, is posel al Yidei Atzmo, and therefore Avram cannot resume his relationship, his marriage with Rachel. B'tamad or kevon sheho ilu nisuin. The Leah, since the marriage relationship between Avram and Leah was valid, if you can call it that, or was powerful enough, La'oshal Yitzchak Baila, therefore Leah is considered like the wife of Avram, and the Mela, Rachel is Asura Midin Achos Ishto, once we recognize the marriage between Avram and Leah. So that is the presentation of Rabbi Am. So it comes out that the Tanna Kama, according to Rabbi Ami, differentiates in the case of Al Pi Bezdin, meaning Eid Echad, between the relationship of Avram and Rachel and Yitzchak, on the other hand, Yitzchak and Leah. Whereas Yitzchak and Leah will be Asura, and that's because of the Knas that we discussed when we're relying on one aid. But on the other hand, as far as Rachel is concerned, that marriage can be resumed because we established that when a man has a relationship with the sister of his wife, he can still maintain and he can be permitted to his wife. That's according to Tanna Kama, and Rabbi Yossi says no. It's all one package deal, and to the same extent, in the case of Eid Echad, Hituru Bezdin, there will be an Iser, which the Tanna Kama concedes to. Nobody argues about that. Between Yitzchak and Leah, so too we have to be consistent, and we are in effect recognizing the marriage between Avram and Leah. I'm sorry, Avram and Leah, and therefore his wife Rachel is classified as Achos Ish. Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha Omar. Now we have a different approach to understanding Rabbi Yossi. Aseifa. In other words, Rabbi Yossi is not commenting on the Mishnah, the beginning of the Mishnah, but rather on the last part of the Mishnah. And the last part of the Mishnah is a case of Eid Echad, who testifies that Mesu Baila Ve'achosa. Now here we have a Girsa problem. 1 second. Right now, I'm going to skip you have it also in parentheses, am I right? So I'm going to skip that for the time being. We'll see if we have to come back to it. He writes that Rashi rejects this girsa, so we'll go with Rashi. Ha the Azli Arusaso Begiso. Di Azli Ishto Vegisa. So when Rabbi Yossi coins, or shall we say, formulates the principle of Shepasal Acher Pasal Atzmo, that's a case of Arusaso Vegiso. And the case of Rabbi Yossi, lo pasal acherim, if afal atzmani pasal, that's Azli Ishto Begisa. So we now, according to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka, we're differentiating between Azli Arusaso and Azli Ishto. And we're going to have to see how Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka understands that distinction. Well, let's go through the two cases of number one, Azli Arusaso Vegiso, and number two, Azli Ishto Vegiso. Arusaso means that Avram never consummated his marriage with Rachel. It was only Erusin. Right? We know what Erusin is, right? Harei Mekudeshesli, but there was no Nisuin. And in the meantime, before any Nisuin could take place, Rachel packed out to Medina Sayyam, and one witness testified that she died. And then Avram went ahead and married Leah. In such a case, Rabbi Yossi's principle is pasel al acherim, pasel al atzma. When does Rabbi Yossi say the exact opposite? Lo pasal achirim v'afal atzma in a posel. That's in Ozla Ishto. She was already Nesua. Rachel was already fully married to Avram, and then she went out to Medina Sayyam. And based on the testimony of one aide, Avram married Leah. And now Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka is going to try to explain the distinction. Let me just take a little bit of a break here to see the diagram. He says, "V'kidesh Avram es Leah." I'm sorry. Kidesh Avram es Rachel. He writes, "L'das Tanakama Leah asura liYitzchak Yidin niseis al pi bezd shekansua chachamim mishum shalobodka v'chakra heitev lifnei sheniseis liach. Avo Rachel muteres liAvram kidin nosachos ishto shein ishto neseres kivur b'mishnah sein." Okay, fine. So that's just a review of everything that we've said until now. Rabbi Yossi Sover, Leah asura liYitzchak, again, because it's 8 echad. Ela shalidaito Tama dover shasur lachso lebailo shema yomru grusha v'nisei sliach girsha v'nisei sliach. So Rabbi Yossi is going to introduce into the equation the chashash that the spectators will think that Yitzchak had delivered a get to his wife, and that's why his wife Leah got married, in this case to Avram. The imtatzal abayla, if we allow Leah to resume her marriage relation with Yitzchak, Yomru shemachzir grushaso mishanisei sliach. V'chashash zeh shayach gav and sheyomru sheyitzchak girsha v'nisei slavram beheter. The Afsha Avram arei ires es Rachel and it says Leah achos arusasim mikom yomru anoshim shohaylo tnayim Rachel v'lo niskayim memela nos Avram es Leah behet. Imtatzar Leah liYitzchak Yomru shehitzigu shasim mishanisei sliach. Why? Because the marriage between Avram and Leah, in the eyes of the spectator, is a valid marriage. She's achos ishto. The answer is there must have been a t'nai in the erusin between Avram and Rachel, and that t'nai was never fulfilled, and therefore Avram had every right to marry his wife's sister because it's not his wife's sister. He was never married to Leah, to Rachel to begin with. We came and show Ilu Nesuim B'Leah, Liosha Al Yitzchak Baila, Uposel al yedei acherim, nechsheves Leah ke'eshes Avram b'drabanan. Because again, the spectator is assuming that Yitzchak had delivered a get before he went out to Sayam to his wife Leah, and therefore Avram had every right legally to marry Leah. Leah is his wife's sister. No, they're going to say that he was never married to his sister because it was a Tanai of the Erisin and that wasn't fulfilled. But once we're recognizing the marriage between Avram and Leah, we therefore have to prohibit Leah from resuming a relationship with Yitzchak because it's Masechet Yevamot and Niseis. V'neseres Rachel lachzor elov mishum achos grushaso mirabon. V'hainu al yidei atzma. So we now understand why Rabbi Yossi, in the case of Eid Echad, is going to have a double Isur. He'll have an Isur for Leah to resume her marriage relationship with Yitzchak, and likewise an Isur for Rachel to resume her marriage relationship with Avram. Because in both cases, the spectator is going to come to the conclusion that the marriage relationship between Avram and Leah is a valid marriage relationship. Number one, they're going to assume that Avram delivered a get before he went out to Medina Sayyam. And number two, they're going to assume that the marriage to Rachel was never validated because there was not a Kiyuma Tanah. Once we recognize the marriage between Avram and Leah, then everything fits into place. Now, as far as Yitzchak is concerned, we have a situation of Masechet Yevamot and Niseis, and as far as Rachel is concerned, we have an Achos Ish. Ukamer Tanakama, Loshna Ishto V'Giso, Loshna Rusaso V'Giso. In both cases, Eshes Giso Asira V'Ishto Sharia. Which means that Leah is not allowed to resume her relationship with Yitzchak because she was Niseis al Pi Eid Echad and Kansur Rabbanan because she didn't do a good job of checking it out. But Ishto, as far as Rachel resuming her relationship with Avram, that's Muteres Lo, because there's no reason to prohibit Ishto. In other words, again, it's not, according to the Chacham, the Tanakama, we're not recognizing the marriage between Avram and Leah. We're not assuming that Yitzchak had delivered a get. The reason why Leah cannot resume her relationship with Yitzchak is because of the Knas, in this case of Eid Echad. But as far as Achos Ishto is concerned, there was never a marriage relationship between Leah and Avram that would require a get and make Rachel into Achos Grushaso, and therefore that relationship could be resumed. Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi now counter argues against the Tanakama. The reason why we're not going to allow the relationship between Leah and Yitzchak to resume, that's not because of Knas, but rather because of the onlooker who thinks that Yitzchak actually delivered a get to Leah. And if we're going to allow Yitzchak to remarry, I don't mean remarry, but resume the relationship, the marriage relationship with Leah, then it's in the eyes of the spectator, he's Masechet Yevamot li'achar shenisei, because they assume, as we said earlier, that Yitzchak delivered a get to his wife, and the marriage between Avram and Leah was a valid marriage relationship, and And Leah is not a chos ishto because we're talking about an arusa situation in which the public are going to interpret it as if there was a t'nai in the Erusin that was never fulfilled. Ukarma le Rabbi Yossi, ishto v'giso, both are asur. The lekel and meimar. Oh, I'm sorry. Now we get to the case of grusha. I meant to say Nesua. I'm sorry, I said grusha, I meant to say Nesua. And here's where Rabbi Yossi says, Lo pasal al acherim, and therefore lo pasal al atzmo. Ishto Nesua lo v'giso, and he got married, and Avram married Leah based on the testimony of one aide. Lekel and Meimar, Noah Havile B'Nesuin, there's no possibility of assuming that the marriage relationship to Rachel was a non-starter because there was full-fledged Nesuin and there's no possibility of being mevatel the Nesuin through T'nai. Then why would it be that Avram married Leah? After all, she's achos ishto. Second. Shum shenosses ishto b'tnai. Bonus kaim b'tnai b'to anesuin. Okay, we have to emphasize the two words. It's like brackets and then a minus sign. So lekelim meimar, we cannot assume that the marriage between Avram and Leah was a valid marriage because she's not achos ishto, because since Avram had married Rachel with a full Nesuin, so there's no T'nai. So everybody knows that the Nesuin, the marriage relationship between Avram and Rachel, is a valid relationship. It's a valid marriage. And now we're going to assume that when Leah gets married to Avram, it's all based on a toes, all based on the assumption that Rachel had died. Eino posel al yidei acher, eino posel al yidei atzmo. Now, why is eino posel al yidei acher? Why don't we assume that Yitzchak gave a get to Leah, One second, that's the piece of the puzzle here that I don't understand. Why don't we assume that there was a get? Posal yidei atzmo. It's also v'gisa dikalamemer tna havile b'kedushin posal yidei acherim is af posal yidei atzmi. If we're going to assume that Leah received the get from Yitzchak and she was allowed to marry Avram, because in the case of Erison, there was a Tnai in the Kiddushin to Rachel, and that Tnai was never fulfilled, and therefore the marriage is batel. So now, if Leah goes back to her husband Yitzchak, everyone is going to say he's being masig rushasim misheniseks. The kaven shebenesu of lachos who posel al yidei acherim. Why? Because the marriage to Leah was valid, because the marriage to Rachel was never valid. There was a t'nai that wasn't miskuyim. Is therefore af posel al yidei atzmi. Because now we're going to assume that his marriage to Leah is valid, and therefore he cannot resume his marriage to Rachel because she is achos ishta. So the only thing I'm missing here, Rabos, as we end for today, it's the only piece of the puzzle I don't have. He says that in the case of Nesua, Eino Posel al Yidei Achet. Let me just try to fill that in just for a second. Ain't T'nai b'nesuin. Fine. We know that there's no T'nai nesuin. Therefore, the marriage between Avram and Rachel certainly is a valid marriage. And now when Avram marries Leah, it's based on toes, thinking that Rachel was dead. Eino posel al yidei achim. Why is that? Well, Yomru Garsha Mikisa. We're not going to assume that Yitzchak gave a get to his wife Leah. I think it goes something like this. I don't have it 100%, but I think the general flow is the following: that once the public realizes that the marriage relationship between Avram and Leah is invalid, and that is because Leah is achos ishto, and then they realize that there may have been some mistake here when Avram went ahead and married Leah, thinking that Rachel was dead, but certainly the marriage is not valid. Once we make that jump, then if the marriage is not valid, there's no reason under the sun that Yitzchak would have had to have given a get to Leah in order to validate the marriage between Avram and Leah, because that marriage is invalid in any event. It's invalid for a different reason, because Leah is achos ishto, because the original marriage to Rachel was a full-fledged marriage to Nesuin, and there's no t'nai, and there's no invalidation, so that the entire operation of the marriage between Avram and Leah was betos, was on a mistaken assumption. Therefore, there's no reason to assume that Yitzchak would have given a get to his wife, because the marriage to Leah between Avram and Leah is not a valid marriage. When we can validate that marriage, because the people are going to say, well, Rachel was an arusa, and there was a t'nai, and it was not valid. So we've already validated the marriage b'toras ha'eshes achos ishto. Then we're going to validate the marriage b'toras ha'eshes ish, assuming the whole marriage is valid. and that means that it must be that Yitzchak gave a get to Leah. Well, if that be the case, then we cannot allow Yitzchak to resume his relationship with Rachel, with Leah, because it's machzir gushas liachar shenises liachar. But in a case of nisuin, where there was a full-fledged marriage between Rachel and Avram, in which case there's no possibility of assuming any sort of invalidation of that marriage, then how could Avram possibly marry Leah? The only possibility of marrying his wife's sister would be if it was a mistake, if the whole deal was off. Once the whole deal is off, we're not going to assume that Yitzchak gave a get to Leah. That assumption was only based on the fact that we validate the marriage between Avram and Leah. So if we're not validating the marriage, then there's no assumption that Yitzchak gave a get to his wife. And if there's no assumption of that sort, then it's not machzir gushas liachar shenises liachar, and therefore, argues Rabbi Yossi, we can resume the relationship between Yitzchak and Leah. Right? But that's in the case of Nisuin, where Rachel was fully married to Avram. In a case of Erisin, where the people are going to say that the reason why Avram could marry Leah is because the marriage to Rachel never got off the ground, there was a t'nai, etc., then we're going to have to validate that marriage between Avram and Leah. Once having done so, we're going to have to assume, again, in the eyes of the public, that Yitzchak had delivered a get to his wife, Leah. And that's why the marriage between Avram and Leah is valid, and therefore we have to asa her on her husband, Yitzchak, because of machzir gushas liachar. That's only in a case of Eris. Okay, then, and we'll just read one more line to finish the sugya. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Meshmuel halacha ki Rabbi Yossi, who passes al yidei atzmo, only in the case where there's a psul al yidei acher. Okay, when we finish the sugya, we have to bench gomel. I mean, it's really, this is a doozy, a whopper of a sugya.